All right, welcome to the fourth installment of NCFS in Captivity, making your pandemic world a brighter and more intellectually stimulating place, we hope. So, today we have Melanie Hawthorne in conversation with François Proulx. Melanie is professor of French in the Department of International Studies at Texas A&M University. She is currently working on a book about Renée Vivien. Her book, Women, Citizenship, and Sexuality, The Transnational Lives of Renée Vivien, Romaine Brooks, and Natalie Barney, is due out from the University of Liverpool Press next year. And her new edition of Vivien's La Dame à la Louve is forthcoming in the MLA Dual Language series. Melanie will be interviewing François Proulx, who is Associate Professor of French and Conrad Humanities Scholar at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champagne. He is Associate Editor of 19th-Century French Studies and serves on the editorial boards of Bulletin d'Information Proustienne and Bulletin Marcel Proust. In 2015, François received an NEH Fellowship for Victims of the book we will be discussing right now, and in 2020, the book's central chapter was awarded the Illinois Humanities Research Prize. He's currently finishing his next book, tentatively titled Inside Proust. Over to you, Melanie and François.
Okay. First of all, let me say, as always, a big thank you to Masha, Susan, and Rachel for organizing this. I know how much we all appreciate this opportunity that we have to get together with each other, even though it's only virtual. So first and foremost, a big thank you. And then to remind people a little bit of the format that we're going to follow, François is going to do a brief presentation to get us started. Then he and I will have some questions, some Q&A. And meanwhile, we'll try to keep an eye on the chat so that any of you can chime in with questions that you have as well, and we'll try to get to those as and when. So without further ado, let me hand things over to François, and he will talk a little bit about his book to get things started.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to our organizers and hosts. All right, here's my PowerPoint that I hope everyone can see. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that this is really an NCFS book to the core. Some of it will sound familiar to you from conference presentations over the years. One chapter was an article in NCFS, the journal. Other chapters resulted from invitations from NCFS colleagues. And I want to express my gratitude to everyone for our exchanges on those occasions. And I look forward to more conversations today. And as a small token of this gratitude, please accept this $5 discount code from the University of Toronto Press. I'm sorry, it can't be more, but if you order directly from the press with the link that's on the slide and also in the chat, the book is already discounted 25%. So the discount code is a little top. We're familiar with a certain story about reading in 19th century France, and that story is centered around women. It can be evoked with just two words. You can say it with me, Madame Bovary, one of the most famous novels of the century. In the 1990s, path-breaking feminist scholarship deepened our understanding of that story, and I'm thinking particularly of two books from 1994, Jan Matlock's Scenes of Seduction, for which this painting by Morisot was the cover, and Janet Weiser's Ventriloquized Bodies, where this painting by Manet is analyzed in a chapter titled Reading Women. These two paintings partake in an 18th and 19th century topos linking women and reading around notions of interiority, secrecy, imagination, and danger. So that topos, the cultural and visual topos, can be summed up in 6 words. I'm trying to keep things really short today. Les femmes qui lisent sont dangereuses. This is a 2005 picture book published by Flammarion that was successful enough that it got an English version in 2016. Women Who Read Are Dangerous. And even a sequel in 2020, Women Who Read Are Increasingly Dangerous. And here's the back of the first cover, which is more visual examples of the topos. In Victims of the Book, I wanted to tell a related but different story about reading and young men in 19th century France. I argue that it's a previously untold or neglected story, and visual culture is a testament to that. It was actually a little more difficult to find an evocative image for the cover. And the one that I found doesn't actually feature reading. There's a young man in a book and a very evocative skull, but there's not actually the act of reading. I want to be very clear that I'm not about what my main argument is and what it's not. So what it's not is some kind of men's rights reactionary argument saying that we've heard quite enough about women in the 19th century and it's time we heard about men for a change. That is really emphatically not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that scholarship that isn't specifically about reading women has tended to treat reading men as an unexamined or ungendered category. For instance, in studies about the roman de formation or la jeunesse, right, a sort of ungendered term for youth, in the Fin-de-Siècle period. So the contribution I hope to make with this book is to apply the reading grids developed by feminist and gender studies to reading men, and young men in particular, as a site of gender definition, deviation, and policing by literary and social commentators. In other words, young men have a gender too, and that gender is the site of a lot of confrontation. So my central argument is this. In late 19th and early 20th century France, earlier discourses about the dangers and pernicious effects of reading and women were redeployed around a new object of concern, the young man. And these anxieties were manifested in a profusion of novels about, as well as often explicitly addressed to, adolescent male readers. And this is where I'm going to make an NCFS confession in front of our gathered colleagues. This actually started out as a 20th century project. 2 months ago in this series, we heard a similar story from Robin Mitchell about her book, Venus Noire, which she told us started as a project about Josephine Baker and then went backwards into the 19th century to do a kind of archaeology of histories of Black women in 19th century France. And the story of this project is a little similar. It started early on in graduate school when we read a text that I think few people read or teach today, and you can tell me in the chat if I'm wrong, Les Thibauts by Roger Martin Dugard. This will be my only textual example, and it's short. So the novel starts like this. This is from chapter 1. We're in turn of century Paris, and 2 teenage boys have run away from their bourgeois homes. The head of their Catholic school, an abbé, a priest, explains to one of the fathers that he discovered in the missing boys' school desk. This is the quote that's in frame. 2 volumes, the Confessions by Rousseau, and graver still, I'm sorry to tell you, sir, a sordid novel by Zola, La Faute de l'Abbé Mouret, to which the father responds, oh, the rascal. And that's not all. The abbé also discovered in that same school desk a gray notebook. And here he lowers his voice. There was a pause and the abbé lowered his voice. The tone and content of these letters in the notebook, alas, left no doubt as to the nature of this friendship. So in that long ago graduate seminar, this led to some discussion. Some participants concluded that the 2 characters in question are gay, and this is a kind of gay representation. And I didn't agree then or now, and in fact in the book it doesn't quite turn out that way. But I had a kind of suspicion, quite unformed then and much more precise now, that there was a story there about the threat or possibility of a kind of gender deviation or something like queerness and that this story was linked to reading by a kind of metonymy, right? In that desk, the two books and the notebook featuring the exchanges between the two boys are literally next to each other, right? So it's a kind of metonymy. And what was most interesting about that story is how lightly sketched it was. This is just 2 pages from that novel. The nature of the friendship is never spelled out because it doesn't apparently need to be. Everyone in the scene understands what the implication is, and the readers of the novel are intimated to understand as well. There's no need for the slightest explanation as to why books by Rousseau or Zola are a horrifying thing to find in the school desk of an adolescent boy. And the link between those two things, the dangerous readings and the dangerous friendships, is never explained either. It's implicit. It just kind of goes without saying in this novel. So in other words, by 1922, which is the date of Les Thibauts by Martin Dugas, that link is part of a cultural code that's not necessarily obvious for us now, but was clearly obvious then, so much so that this scene can read as a kind of parody or satire. The characters are, I would argue, acting out a familiar and slightly outdated script by the year 1922. So in order to understand this cultural code or story being referenced here and in other 20th century novels about boys and reading, Les Faux Monnayeurs by Gide is another example that a lot of you are probably very familiar with. I had to go back a few decades, and this became then a 19th century project. I realized I had to read broadly in order to understand the code in question that was so familiar to Martin Dugas, Gide, Proulx, and others. And what I found was a widespread subgenre of late 19th century novels about young men and reading. There are about 70 of these cited in the book, and they represent many more that I read over the course of the project. I'm just going to give you a couple of titles as examples. So these novels often foreground a generic young man in the title, a jeune homme, right? Or the title is the name of the young male protagonist. And they're also often first novels, and sometimes only novels. Sometimes the author just kind of drops out of the literary field. And that highlights the extent to which these novels tell a generic story, right? They tell the kind of story that a young author publishing a first novel thinks will make a good story for a novel, right? It's a very generic story. Les Désirs de Jean Servien by Anatole France is a good example. It's actually the first novel that he wrote, although not the first novel that he published, and that's a complicated story that I won't get into. So these titles also underline how these novels are about, they present adolescence as a time of transition, right? The first struggles, information, the uncertain age, molting season. They allude to the dangers that face adolescent males: a barren life, the fever of the unknown, a deadly impotence. And most of all, they insistently describe youth as a time of crisis, youth in crisis, the crisis in virility, or just a crisis. Before I wrap up, I just want to make one last point about methodology, because reading across a broad corpus like this necessarily involves what some critics have called distant reading, which we can think of in horizontal terms, right, as a panorama or landscape or a tracking shot if we're thinking in film terms. And in distant reading, we're reading not for detail, but for patterns or recurrences or topoi. What's interesting when we practice distant reading on these novels as a group isn't their specificity, which is pretty minimal, but the number and the frequency of elements that recur across part of, or sometimes almost all of the corpus. However, there are no maps, graphs, or trees in this book. I made a conscious choice not to include any tables or quantitative data. So there's never do I tell you, well, in 65% of my 70 novels, there's a best friend character who's more masculine, and so on. Because I think that kind of data is always debatable. And also because that kind of data tends to really flatten what's actually interesting about these novels is that they're novels, they're stories, right? So rather than approach them as data points, I approach them as stories, which involves another kind of reading that we're all very familiar with, close reading. Close reading we can think of in vertical terms, right? It's sort of going below the surface. It's focusing on a passage or pausing for a close-up if we're thinking still in film terms. And close reading, which we all learn to do, although it's somewhat out of favor critically these days, close reading allows me to unpack the symptoms of the unresolved contradiction that's at the center of all of these novels. How do you write a book against reading, right? That's completely contradictory, and none of these novels really solve that, but the symptoms of that denied contradiction are really interesting and multiple. So in terms of methodology, I call my approach in this book dynamic reading, which is simply a mobile combination of those two modes of reading, akin to montage of different shots in a film or adjusting the focus in a camera. This is my last slide. This is a very brief chapter outline. In part one, there's 3 parts in the book. In part one, I survey the corpus more generally, looking at prefaces and endings in chapter 1 and representations of male reader characters in chapter 2. In part 2, I examine the 3 most frequent plots in these novels through a representative and canonical or semi-canonical example, novels by Vallès, Bourget, and Barrès. And in part 3, I move to the early 20th century and ask how Martin Dugard, Gide, and Proust negotiated different ways out of that paradox of the book against books. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Great. Thank you very much. And I will note in passing that your background is a great illustration of your methodology. So, you know, we do have, in fact, a visual to represent it. So it's perfect. So to start off the questions, since we are in this pandemic, and reading is actually one of the pleasures that has not been denied us in the pandemic, but it does mean that we are very much at a time when we're thinking about communicable diseases and illnesses. And you talk in the book about the ways that reading was presented as a pathology in the late 19th century, in the Fin-de-Siècle period. So maybe you could review for us a little bit some of the metaphors and what they reveal, and talk a little bit about how this illness is spread. You know, how do you get infected with this?
Yes, with the reading disease. Well, I think what's most interesting about the metaphor of reading as illness, it's a very prevalent and very old metaphor. What's most interesting is how double-sided.
1 second, François, and say, can you speak louder? We have a question. We have a request that you can speak up a bit. Thank you. Sorry.
All right. Sure. I think what's most interesting about these very prevalent and very old metaphors of reading as nourishment on the one hand and reading as a kind of poison on the other is precisely how double-sided they are. And that it's a very long textual tradition. In the Bible, the word as nourishment is a very, very frequent metaphor. And in Plato, the word as poison is an equally frequent metaphor. So I think a lot of these contradictions or quarrels are fed from that dual stock, if you will. As critics, of course, we're familiar with Derrida's essay on Plato's pharmacy, and that's very much in the background of some of my reflections in the first part of the book. Right? It's a kind of unsolvable contradiction that the book or the novel is a cause of illness, and yet it's also proposing itself as a cure, as if words can only be cured by more words, which then requires more cure, and we never really get out of it. And if you dig deeper into history, you see that, for instance, in the French context, in 17th century debates about theater, whether theater is a social good or a social illness, those metaphors recur as well. And one of the most concise ways that I found to think about that dual metaphor is through a sort of Platonic Aristotelian duality, right? That for Plato it's a poison, and for Aristotle it's also the cure through catharsis. And you see that in the strategies deployed by the books. So in the 19th century novels that I examine, the cure, the catharsis, is often violent, either a violent renunciation, never, the character vows to never read books again, which again returns us to that paradox, because you're reading a book where the character decides to never read again, and it's a little bit ambiguous if you're also supposed to just sort of shut the book at that point and
throw it away.
Like in Les Nourritures Terrestres, just throw it away when you're done. Or renunciation through a violent act, killing a character who embodies reading or books, or burning a library, that kind of thing. As for the illness itself, it's manifested in the characters, in the male characters, both physically through symptoms of degeneracy, of frail limbs, weak bodies, overdeveloped craniums sometimes, but also psychologically, in melancholy states, and neurasthenia, which is a sort of fin-de-siècle syndrome, or often in suicide. And contagion, according to these books, this is maybe a little too close for comfort with our current day, but contagion apparently happens when you least expect it, right? So it's through your friends,
Perfect.
through a book that just happened to be lying at the wrong place at the wrong time and you picked it up, or, and this is really too close for comfort, but through schools. I'm sorry to say, schools are,
Yeah.
I'm really not trying to make black humor here, but schools are often brought up as a big site of this kind of metaphorical contamination, and it's no surprise that these novels crop up in the 1880s and 90s during a period of really rapid and intensive school reform in the French Third Republic.
A quick follow-up question that occurred to me was, is this part of a bigger kind of anti-intellectualism? You mentioned the sort of, the overdeveloped brain and the...
I think so. I mean, you can think to the work of some of our 19th century French studies scholars about the rise of sport, and even the role of sports in schools, and those kinds of discourses in that same period, that same fin-de-siècle period. Of course, it's always tricky to argue that it's completely period specific, because those debates happen and recur at a lot of different moments.
Yeah.
But certainly they're related, and of course it's also related to 1870 and 71, the defeat and the Commune, and the cultural consequences that had for concepts of masculinity, and the pretty widespread idea that something went wrong in the French social body.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking of that, and the emphasis on the need for men of action who would save France and not be.
Oh yeah, and some of the same people who are arguing we don't need Latin taught in schools are the same people who are arguing we need physical education, for example. So it's really quite related, for sure.
Yeah. Good. Okay. I'm sticking a little bit with the sort of the notion of communicable disease, if you will allow, because I also want to sort of ask you about the way that reading functions as a kind of seduction, which is another of the threads that you pursue. And I think, you started out by talking about Madame Bovary, and, we're all familiar with the fact that that's based on a fait divers and the role of faits divers and real life news items in literature in the 19th century. But maybe you can talk a little bit about the Bourget case that you talk about in the book, and Le Disciple, which is also based on a real life crime story.
Sure. Well, that's always been my favorite chapter, so I'm always happy to talk about it. And it's literally the central chapter of the book. I think it's and it's the most interesting case study for all of the issues that I talk about. Bourget's Le Disciple was published in 1889. It's based on a real-life murder trial from 1888, in which the accused was said to have modeled himself on Le Rouge et le Noir from 1830, which we all know also was based on a fait divers from 1827. Everyone in this crowd knows Le Rouge et le Noir, and we know that Julien Sorel, the main character, models himself on Napoleon because he's read Napoleon's memoirs, where Napoleon himself talks about having read Rousseau. And so there's a chain of reference there that constantly crosses back in and out of fiction and of real life, and that's what really grabbed me at first in this case. And the way that I approached it through transcripts of the trials and articles in the press and so on is to use that gender studies lens, because it quickly became apparent that something was going on between Bourget and the accused in 88, and questions of identification and Stendhal and so on. So the queer business, if you will, remains implicit, but I argue that that's what's going on with Seduction, that these are not stories, even though it's women getting murdered in fiction and in reality. These are not principally stories of heterosexual seduction, and that the protagonists, the readers, are seduced by fiction and by fictional characters, so that the accused murderer in 88 is seduced by Julien Sorel in a way, the same way that Julien Sorel is seduced by reading, or seduced by Napoleon, if you want to make a little bit of a shortcut, right? We could really have an NCFS debate about this. My argument, or my reading, is that in Le Rouge et le Noir, Julien is not in love with Madame de Rênal or with Mathilde. He's in love with books and with what books represent. And in the period where the Chambige affair and Bourget take place, and Bourget's writing, and the period that I'm concerned with in the book, Le Rouge et le Noir and the character of Julien become a kind of embodiment of that seductive power, a sort of shorthand for it, which is something very, there's something very queer, and it's very close to the Oscar Wilde trials, but we're just not yet at that moment where these implicit dangers get named and get labeled. It's still all couched in a language of circumlocution and a kind of sous-entendu, but it's just under the surface.
Well, just to kind of push the point a little bit, wonder if you can speculate maybe why that is. I mean, in Oscar Wilde, so male same-sex activity is criminalized. I mean, there's reasons why that love dare not speak its name. The situation's a little bit different in France. It's not criminal. So I just wonder, I'm springing this question on you, right? So feel free to kind of say, like, I don't know. But can you speak to that a little bit? Why this remains so sort of below the radar?
I think that the danger is a danger of a kind of homosociality that actually is it's an ugly word, but it is actually a homo-anti-sociality, and that's the danger that's pinpointed here, much more so than whether people of the same sex got it on or not, which, as you say, wasn't actually illegal, although frowned upon and right, had serious consequences for the people who got caught. But the danger that traverses all of these narratives, the narrative in Bourget's novel, the narrative that gets told in the courtroom in 88, in the press reports, the narrative of Le Rouge et le Noir, is that some people, especially malleable young men, will end up preferring the world of fiction or books to the life narrative that they're supposed to embark on, which is respectable, bourgeois, heterosexual, productive and reproductive, and sort of traced for them in advance. So it's that danger of deviation through the seductions of fiction and of other like-minded individuals, whether or not there's a homosexual component. In a lot of cases, we just don't know. I mean, it gets very close to some kind of incriminating stuff in Bourget's youth correspondence that was discovered in pretty recent years that I got to cite in some of the footnotes. But there's never a sort of smoking gun. We just get close.
Yeah, and I want to come back around to talk about the queerness a little bit more. I'm just seeing a question from Peggy Walla in the chat. Could you say more about the danger of anti-homosociality?
I think what happens in the Chambige affair is that it gets it's exposed as an antisocial trend or a danger that's perceived to be gathering power, right? Because Chambige, who is accused of having shot this married woman very much in the style of the Rouge et le Noir, but there is this mouvement de sympathie among the students in Paris who find his action noble because it echoes the Rouge et le Noir. And the press, across the political spectrum really falls down on that and says, we can't have the youth of our nation elevating this guy as their champion and as their figurehead. This is catastrophic. If all of a sudden murdering a married mother of two is a heroic action, this is fine and good in novels, but this is real life. We can't keep confusing the two. And that's really the danger, more so than whether or not Chambige got a little too close to some of his school friends at various moments or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sticking with the sort of the queerness that you've kind of raised, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more about queerness in the book. And in particular, I want to think about some more about whether reading is an expression of, male homoeroticism or a replacement for it.
Right. I actually, I steer really clear of, for example, the word effeminate or of any discussion of the model of inversion, which sort of is on the rise medically in the late 19th century. Because that's not exactly what I found in the text. What really gets represented over and over is what I call instead failures of masculinity. So the possibility of queerness is always, is always just sort of next door to that, right? It's always on the horizon of it. But this isn't quite the same as effeminacy or inversion or same-sex acts. It's about deviation. It's about that failure, various forms of failure, whether it's physiological or psychological or narrative. That failure to just sort of stay on the straight and narrow and become a père de famille and become a productive member of society, a shopkeeper or a bourgeois, or to stay in your lane and stay in your class and those kinds of straight and narrow, right? So yes. I use the word queer as a kind of passe-partout, right. A historical term, but it's very rarely about homosexual acts themselves, and more so about this sort of threat of deviation that seems to follow all of these male reader adolescent characters.
Right, and the class angle seems really interesting as well. Sort of when you put that alongside it, it's not simply about staying in your lane sexually, but staying in your lane in terms of class as well.
Sure.
There's another.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
In the Anatole France novel that I mentioned, Le Désir de Jean Servien, there's a really, really clear example because the father is a bookbinder who doesn't know how to read. So he belongs to one class. He's clearly ouvrier. He's clearly working class. He has a certain relationship to print, which is material only. He doesn't know how to read it, but he knows how to make it. And the son is the opposite. The son went to a collège, and the son doesn't know how to make a book, but he knows how to read a book. And he's the one who ends up in trouble. And he's the one who ends up deviating and chasing illusions. And he's the one who ends up joining the commune and dying on the barricades at the end of the narrative. So it's a very clear example.
Yeah, so literacy is also kind of an index of class aspiration as well, I think, which is an interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in Valais, the same thing. Yeah.
I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to the chat because there's a few questions. So I'm can't see some of the earlier. Oh, here we go. There's one question that says from Jennifer Yee, who says, if you could comment on how this fin-de-siècle anxiety and the young male reader fits in with the older traditions of misreading by men, Julien Sorel, but also Tartarin de Tarascon, and all the way back to Don Quixote.
Yeah, of course. I do talk about the sort of longer history of that trope in the introduction. Of course, Don Quixote is the most famous example. I argue in the little survey that I give that in the 17th and 18th century that topos inherited, at least in part, from the reception of Don Quixote in France, which was substantial with a lot of translations and a lot of diffusion, gets transferred onto women readers for different reasons, so that the sort of disorderly reader embodied by Quixote ends up being a lectrice déraisonnable or dangereuse certainly by the 18th century, and we see that in a lot of texts that we like, La Nouvelle Héloïse or Liaison Dangereuse, or pretty much any libertine novel from the 18th century where there's always a dangerous book lying around that's going to have consequences for the innocent young girl. So there's shifts in gender across the centuries, I would argue, and I think because of certain historical and social reasons in the 19th century, the discourse gets transferred or shifted back onto men for just a period of time, and then it moves on to other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I'm going back to the chat, and there's a question here from Catherine Masson who asks, does this exemplify what Foucault said, ce qui n'est pas ordonné à la génération ou transformé par elle n'a plus ni lieu ni verbe non plus?
Whew.
Shall I repeat that?
Yeah.
So this is Foucault. This is a quotation from Foucault.
Yeah.
Ce qui n'est pas ordonné à la génération ou transformé par elle n'a plus ni lieu ni verbe non plus.
Qui n'est pas ordonné. Maybe it's the French that's throwing me off. Je suis désolé parce que c'est un peu dommage.
It's okay. We'll come back around, and if Catherine wants to rephrase, in the chat, I can ask you again. But we have another question, which is, among these anxieties about masculinity, have you noticed any anxieties linked to social hierarchies appear as well? I think we've sort of touched on that. But
yeah, I think we touched on that.
Any difference between lower class masculinity and lower class, if the book presents a risk by destabilizing control over lower classes, which is slightly different to the sort of the aspiration of the lower classes to rise up the social ladder? Right.
Well, the characters, even though these books are addressed to la jeunesse, sort of what sounds like a broad category, they feature characters who belong to a pretty narrow category of bourgeois young men, or sort of rising bourgeois young men. The novels by Valès are an example of this, a sort of failure to rise to the status of bourgeois and its consequences. But I found few novels, and maybe that could be a different study, about men who are not on a class trajectory, men who are in the working class and stay in the working class. That did not seem to be a story that was told often in ways that involved reading as a plot device, or as a topic, or as a concern. I think when reading is introduced, then there's that notion of class movement, either successful or unsuccessful, with consequences in each case.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Willa Silverman says, I've had the pleasure of reading your book, but I've now forgotten whether you discussed whether in these
Fin-de-Siècle?
texts, books themselves are gendered as they are in much bibliophile. Willa, I don't know what FDS is.
Fin-de-Siècle?
Oh, Fin-de-Siècle, of course. Duh. Okay. So bibliophile literature, for example. If so, what's the significance of the gendering?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. So I can think of some scenes where a book is shared between schoolboys, for example, and it's somehow metaphorically made to embody la femme, right? At least an illusion of what the schoolboys believe to be a woman, which is then immediately contradicted by whatever experiences they have with actual women, usually prostitutes, in this very recurring scenario. So yes, I can think of some occurrences. I wouldn't say that it's a particularly frequent tropes, because bibliophilia and young men are not frequently connected in this corpus, at least. Yeah. It's often, if anything, they go into the library of the father or the uncle who collects books or something like that. So it's there's a difference in generation that separates the two.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the book as a stand-in for the woman, because that, it creates the sort of the triangulation of the desire as mimesis, right? That this is the text is the thing that mediates the relationship.
Oh, yes, and Willa Silverman, of course, wrote the book on this, also from University of Toronto Press.
There we go. Everything comes around full circle.
Yeah.
So another comment that we have in the chat is, I like the relationship you established between, if I understand well, the fact that the threat of queerness is not openly stated, a cultural code, and the language of pathology. So in that sense, can we say that the absence of language also becomes a symptom in itself? The absence of narrative becomes the narrative.
Yes, it's a question from one of my graduate students, so thank you, and I really like that question. I think absolutely, we can think back to the brief example that I gave at the very beginning from Martin Dugard. The type of amitié, or the type of friendship, isn't name, it's simply une de ces amitiés, but the absence of naming is actually what labels it, is actually what makes it legible as a potentially queer and therefore worthy of condemnation relationship. Right? So absolutely that those silences, those gaps, those circumlocutions, and this happens in the Chambly's trial as well. Sometimes quite, I don't want to say explicitly, but it's a form of implicitly making a point that is so loudly implicit, and so that sort of gives you these big flashing lights around what's implied, that you have almost that actually becomes a pretty clear code for what's imagined to be going on, whether or not it's actually going on.
I'm seeing a link here that ties us back to what we were saying earlier about the connections with Oscar Wilde, and not just something that dare not speak its name or cannot speak its name, but in fact is more powerful by choosing not to speak its name. In some ways.
Sure. And I end the Bourget chapter with a comparison to Wilde, actually, because they knew each other, they were contemporaries. The picture of Dorian Gray is full of references, as we all know, to French literature and to the Fin-de-Siècle. And Bourget and Wilde end up on very different paths. The same year that one accedes to the Académie Française, the other one is in prison, breaking rocks. So it's a very clear and tragic illustration of the social benefits and penalties of hedging the line, as Bourget very much did, or going slightly over, as
Yeah.
Wilde did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's another comment here from Benedict, who is asking about the dangers of reading per se, or is reading also presented as an antidote in some other venues, other than reading those novels themselves, of course?
Right. It's often a kind of blanket condemnation, which is very strange when you think about it, because in terms of the school debates, for example, this recurs a lot. Boys are taught to read in the schools of the Republic, which is imagined to be a social good, and the texts that they're made to read in class are imagined to be a positive influence. And yet they go and use that skill that they learned in class outside of class, and they read, cheap newspapers, they read whatever books are lying around the house, or they're books that pass between groups of friends. And so that's an example of an effort to sort of distinguish between good and bad reading. But what often happens is there's a lot of bleeding between the two, and that for the increasingly intoxicated, any kind of reading can have that toxic effect, right? Even the most innocuous text. So maybe it's more of a question of dosage, but any attempt to sort of draw a line between this is okay and this is not okay is doomed to, in these novels, is almost kind of doomed to fail. You very often end up at that moment of very violent renunciation, where just the library has to be burned, all books have to be renounced, closed, and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you. And I'm going back. There's still one more question in the chat. So another question from Peggy Waller, who says, I'm struck by the similarities between your findings in Victims of the Book and what one might say about the early 19th century mal du siècle, trying to get that pun verbally. One big difference is that I don't remember the loud reaction against male passivity and alienation as a bad model for masculinity. Would you like to comment on those possible differences or similarities, only if they're useful to you?
I think that's a great question. And it's maybe an easy answer, but I think the date of 1870 might be one part of the answer. It's actually really interesting to think of the early and mid 19th century, that was mentioned in an earlier session. We tend to think of as the more sort of dowdy period of the 19th century because of the hairstyles and so on, and book publishers are, they sort of twisted my arm to put Fin-de-Siècle in the title because that apparently sells more.
Good to know.
But in gender terms, the early and mid 19th century might have been a little more, I don't want to say progressive, but might have been less policed, let's say, and have entertained more possibilities. Whereas there is this reaction to perceived deviations in the Fin-de-Siècle period, and the immediate explanation for that is the Franco-Prussian War and the defeat. I mean, that seems to have had, and not only in the critical literature, but even if you go back to the contemporary commentators, a lot of them are pretty explicit in making that link, that we were defeated, therefore we are now suffering in our dans notre jeunesse and in our social body, or we were defeated because we were already decadent and the defeat has only made things worse. So I think that's one possible answer for that difference between the early and the later parts of the century.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if this is a good stopping point or if we have time for one more question. I'm looking to Rachel to give me a clue here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm popping back in here.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm like when you come out of the breakout room.
Yes.
Um, I thought maybe if there are any last questions in the chat, but I did want to ask a question myself, so I'm going to take advantage of the MC
Go for
privileges
it.
here. And you started by talking about the female victims of the book, and I was really struck when you were talking about Julien and others as being ultimately in love with books, which is maybe one way to describe Madame Bovary. So I wondered how different these pathologies are in the end, and whether you kind of thought about that in the, I guess, distant reading model
Yeah.
of things.
I think they're not that the pathologies are not that different or distinct because gender is not that rigid or absolute. So it can, between decades and between centuries, it can sort of shift from one group to the others, and there's a lot of carryover, and that power of seduction and that relationship are not that different. Of course, the imagined effects of reading and of books on both genders are imagined to be gendered themselves by the commentators doing the commenting. But that maybe tells us more about gender conceptions in 19th century France than it does about the effects of reading for 19th century people or for us today. So I think
Right.
there's more similarity and difference.
And at the end of the day, they were afraid of women not fulfilling their, the roles
Oh
that they
yeah,
were, right? Um, and they were diagnosing women with hysteria while they were diagnosing the men with neurasthenia. So sort of different names for some of the same things.
for some of the same stories actually. Yeah.
Right. And Emma, I'm just thinking about how, she becomes sort of masculine through this reading and taking on these different kinds of roles. So I don't know how that fits in with some of your.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think that book or those books about Madame Bovary just happened to have been written very well already,
Right. Yes.
maybe by some of the people in this Zoom call.
Yep.
So I thought I would tell, as I said at the beginning, a related but similar story.
Absolutely. And was a really interesting one that you told beautifully. So thank you
Okay.
so much for this conversation. As I was sitting here as a listener, having been a speaker last week, and I'm nodding and smiling and thinking, he can't see me doing any of this. So know that all the people here were smiling and nodding all along the way. And sadly, that is something that you can't always feel in the Zoom. But now I invite everyone to put your cameras back on and smile. And we'll stick around for those of you who have to leave. Thank you for joining us, and we'll stick around and continue to chat informally.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Melanie, and thanks to everyone for attending, and thank you for your questions. I really appreciate it.